Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Carolina and everyone here at Loop for inviting me here to speak this morning and for hosting these episodes of What is Deep Sea Mining by Inhabitants, and in general for promoting time-based media. I think we're all passionate about it, so it's good to remember that today time-based media is maybe not appreciated everywhere the same way it should be. And it's a pleasure to be back in Barcelona. So my question today, and I hope to take you a little bit on a ride, is what are institutions of care? And how can these institutions, the institutions of care, be re-socialized, brought back into the social realm? Which means, how can we transfigure care from something very personal, very private, to something social, which is invested in the civic and becomes a civic endeavor. And the reason I want to look at this question, and I've made some notes, I will always look at them, I hope you forgive me, is that there is, as we can see here at the fair, everywhere else, in the festivals and biennials of this world, there is a recent surge in the interest for the ecologies, for extinction, for post-human concerns, for mattering of matter, as I would like to call it. What is the matter of which this world is made, on which we're standing, which we're negotiating, whether it is the outer space, the terrestrial space, or the oceanic space that I will be talking about a little bit. So what are these matterings? And as many would like to argue, and I would like to argue, it is a time for radical departures and a time with very high stakes. So I will dare to be a little bit more inspirational and less technical, if you allow me, because I think that these stakes demand, different considerations of what we do and how we do things we do. So these will be my first introductory moves, and then I'll speak about TBA 21 and I'll go more, let's say, in the institutional spiel, and please do ask me anything you want. So we start with this first picture. I've recently returned from a trip to Papua New Guinea, a voyage under the flag of TBA 21 Academy. And among many other things, I encountered there the mystery of siphonophores. And I would like to use these fragile animals as a figure, as a figuration, to help me think about the ways in which institutions of art can contribute to processes of re-socialization. So marine scientists say that a siphonophore, so one of these creatures, is a colony, meaning there's many, many creatures representing one organism. It's a colony of co-working organisms whose internal dramaturgy allows them to live together just as if they were one. So they consist of hundreds of organisms who pack up, who share responsibility, who exist together, and they're so puzzling that science uses complex orientational diagrams. I'll show you one of these. That's another one. Another one, we can go back to these. These are the orientational diagrams, that try to even find a way how to describe how these zooids, as they're called, are attached to sort of a main organ or a main artery that connects all these individual little entities. Yeah? And by the way, I want to say something about these little ones here, because as you can see, they're individually signed. Yeah? They've been done by a cohort of elderly ladies from Florida who are actually deep sea divers and who take these photographs as a passion. And they're some of the best photographs of siphonophores and deep sea animals that you can find. They're wonderful. And they signed them, with their little logos. That's another one. That's one we took on this expedition. Again, all these little dots, they're all singular organs that sort of form an entity. And I'll show you one video here. No, I will not show you a video. I think I need you. Technical assistance. Um, so they are so puzzling, as I said, that not only does science use these organizational diagrams, but to describe the distribution and the organization, how they work, but actually they represent a singular order of animals. So I would like to think of siphonophores as an evolved aquatic sisterhood, a rebellious life form that is so fragile, eccentric, and mysterious that we actually have to set them apart as a separate sort of order and entity. So in the Pacific waters, these sisters are everywhere. So the delicate long nets seen through transparent tissue float with the currents. Only ever so faintly we recognize an orange or green knot, an organ perhaps, an inner design that articulates the many. So all these little dots here articulate the many in one in the cohort. So as other zooids of the deep, they singularize through bioluminescent signals which shine and sparkle in the deep dark of the oceanic night. So I'm aware that biologists and scientists resist the fact, and they've told me so many times, that we in the arts and humanities are using and perhaps perverting their nomenclature to speak of things we understand nothing about. And also, you might wonder why we need these creatures to speak of institutions of care. So firstly, I want to say concepts and theories don't belong to anyone. And they are ways for us to play with the word. And I think we need to play with the world as imaginatively as possible today more than ever. So theories and ideas are manifestations of the world. They are in the world. We just have to find them, and we have to use them wherever we need them. So if I invite siphonophores to think with, I don't invite big science, and I don't invite biology, but a new friend that I found in the Pacific. And I also would say that sometimes, using animals that are so small, but they're organized so wisely, and they've evolved in a way that is so incomprehensible, that we actually understand something about things that are so different. So we're changing context, we're changing scales, we're moving in and out. And sometimes these operations can be helpful, inspirational, as I said, to sort of consider where we stand in what we do. So I'm thinking of siphonophores as model institutions. As I said, as sisterhoods that are curious and curiously organized in their one-in-many arrangement. And we can only laugh at the wild, fantastic fantasies of the marine world. But I'm also arguing that in times of epistemological destabilization, we cannot simply take up issues. Today, poverty, malnutrition, yesterday, animal rights and polar bears, and tomorrow, whatever else comes across. Shopping for tragic causes, even if very well meant, can be as detrimental to the world and to the imaginary as ignoring them. The emotional or artistic investment in the catastrophic, so in this whole resurgence of catastrophe as a theme, must be deconstructed with attention for the underlying reasoning. So why it is done, how it is done, what tool it is done with, and how we actually attach it to other long-standing beliefs and figurations. So I urge us to acknowledge the death and dying, violence and injustice at the heart of the catastrophic convergences that we're calling the Anthropocene and we're experiencing or are about to experience. And here I'm quoting Eva Hayward, that by catastrophizing the world as environment takes on all those features and affective tendencies that come to structure the self-enclosed Cartesian man. So what Eva says here is that the idea of catastrophizing, of creating the catastrophe almost, with the biblical reasoning, actually doesn't do anything to our understanding of ontologies and epistemologies. We're just continuing the same track. We're just sort of using the whole figure that has been biblically with us and continuing to establish, we're the man, we are men, we are humanity, we're the superiors in our existences, and not doing what actually should be done, which is a re-questioning of who we are, how we live together, and how actually forms of cohabitations under a different planetary regime could be possible. Yeah? So, in this sense, the sisterhood of siphonophores leads me to one of the most fundamental lessons of feminism, which is to have critical concern for all kinds of injustices, segregation, any sexualized bodies that are different, and which have been subjugated to binary exclusions. So binary as a male and female, nature, culture, rational, emotional, and all this deconstruction of the binaries, through concern and care, is something which should be sort of the political project which is ahead of us. So that would be my first point concerning institutions engaged with the political ecologies of today. So the first question, is your institution a sisterhood of siphonophore? Is it organized like this weird, there's another one. Let's see if it moves. No, again, not, well, you got the idea anyway. It is organized like these weird cohorts, or is it follow linear hierarchical models? Does it understand issues of justice as a xeno-epistemic project, as a project of epistemic otherness, one that pays attention and notices forms of othering and difference? And if so, in what ways? So moreover, as I said, can we continue to use the same tools to deal with the issues we find appalling, vexing, ethically, politically untenable? Can we engage the same forms of understanding the same worlds we have to try to analyze and address for ever so long? Perhaps, and there are many reasons to think so, it is time to change the way we're trying to understand, we're trying to know, we're trying to represent the worlds around us. Maybe we need to think with much more imagination. To me and to many others, knowing differently, for me, very important concept, knowing differently, knowing otherwise, is encapsulated in the practice of thinking with, thinking in partnership, in cohorts, in entanglement, with the siphonophores, with water, with ecologies, with other. It's the practice of moving from one to the many, from private to the public, from human-centered rationalistic reasoning to post-humanist forms of engagement, from the wide angle to the nearsighted, from distance to proximity and back. Because thinking, especially thinking in art and with art, and thinking with the challenges of our time, takes art, and it takes imagination. And the repopulation of the imaginary with alien affects and new subaquatic friends and new forms of communities takes a lot of courage. And allowing ourselves as siphonophoric aggregation to take a position of proximity, of intimacy, of closeness, of entanglement, all of this is very unsettling. Rationalism has taught us to think from a distance, at arm length, at least be remote from the object that we are studying, that we're looking at. Everything else we call actionism, and actionism apparently has nothing to do with thinking. I would say, and going through the videos and the work that I've seen, at least so far here in the fair, I think a lot of artists and a lot of us are interested in understanding the world we're in and applying forms of research that is somehow different from what we've seen in the last years. And I think I would like to still stay with this image of the siphonophore and call it siphonophoric research. And it's one that reorganizes the object of research. It's a way to see research not as a practice of dissection and categorization and objectivization of the object of research, but one approaching it with a great deal of fantasy and imagination. And, Arjuna Parudai, who's fantastic, fantastic thinker, calls research as the historically and anthropologically specific practice of the imagination. And I think that is very, very important message, if I can stress that. Research as a practice of the imagination. So I can only repeat, it's a practice that is intimate, full of desires and complication, crowded and populated with other more than human entities, with matters and mattering, and with many other life forms whose needs and desires should concern us. So, more precisely then, let me move a little bit closer to what we do at TBA 21. Oh, look at that. Now they are. Aren't they wonderful? Anyway. So, TBA 21, founded by Francesca von Habsburg, Francesca Thyssen-Bornemisza, based in Vienna, but has two other venues and entities, one building up in Madrid with an office and a headquarter in collaboration with the Museum Thyssen, that is Francesca's father's, Heinrich von Thyssen-Bornemisza's, founding or part of his collectionary legacy. The other space is based in Venice, called the Ocean Space. And in all entities of TBA 21, we've been dealing for quite a while with what I'd like to call the political ecologies of our times. So it's ecologies in the intersection of politics, in the intersection of art and science. And we've been engaging and dealing with artists whose concerns for the changing ecologies of life under the regimes of planetary transformation, called the Anthropocene, have generated, as I said, forms of research that we find intimate, slow, invested, and imaginary. We've tried to bring together many undisciplined spaces, the science lab, the artist studio, the university, the activists, and hopefully, some of the field of the commons where we do, share still the resources of humanity. And you have to look at the commons when you work with the oceans, because the oceans, as we know, not all of the oceans are territorial waters. We still have, as humanity, a big stake of what is the extraterritorial seas. So we have created a research lab called TBA 21 Academy. Yeah, that is the arm that actually is mainly invested in oceanic research, and the space called the Ocean Space, situated in Venice in the Church of San Lorenzo, opened last year in March, invested again in the issues of the oceanic. So for the Academy and the Ocean Space, thinking with water has become a mission and a mandate. It inspires the institutions, its agents, to think with the element which they are researching. So it's not thinking from outside, it's thinking with the water, it's thinking from inside, thinking slowly and noticing with care. So thinking with water, or thinking with matter, for that matter, mobilizes specific ways to knowing, reaching below the surface, swimming with the tides and the whirls and the currents, and running along the water's pelagic column. It also means to sharpen attentiveness towards the political ecologies and ontologies of state. So what is a resource? Whose claim do we listen to? How do we address this unnatural nature that we call environment? It draws us away from the duality of human and nature, of earth and world, of nature and culture, to acknowledge the enmeshed conditions of the ocean's vast and terrible changes. So as many ocean thinkers have shown, we need to decompose and take apart the totalities to unsettle the solidified contours of such ambitions. And we need to engage with the oceans and its inhabitants in dissecting the Anthropocene's universalizing claims and redistribute faculties and conditions into the situated and entangled locales. So,
only if we consider, that is my final point on the oceans, only if we consider the oceans as the alien others, a world that is so different and so strange that it actually remains unknowable, because its unknowability is a condition of its essential entity, then we start sort of looking at the oceans, in their unknowability, in this body of otherness, as a possibility to sort of engage with a space that is so utterly both close and far and distant to us. This first slide, I'm showing you, how much time do we have? Another 20 minutes? Okay, so this first work by John Akomfar, Purple, was commissioned, as all the pieces that I will show you here, was commissioned by TB21 Academy as part of, as I said, these oceanic researches and voyages that the Academy is organizing. So John and his team went on one of the expeditions into the Marquesas Island. Actually, the boat on which the expedition took place comes up quite often in the installation itself. So the Marquesas is part of Polynesia, which is one of the sites, one of the many sites of this very large and very epic 6-channel video installation. It's one of a series of work that John Akomfar has dedicated to the Anthropocene, which is his main object of concern over the past years, trying to find a language how to represent and how to engage with the disasters of, climate catastrophe. Yeah? And Purple specifically is about the tremendous ability of humans, their extreme destructive power, as he sort of starts to demonstrate in the enmeshment of these images. So basically how, as many other multi-screen installation, how this one works is obviously there's a huge soundscape which unifies all the 6 screens, but otherwise, the images basically move from one side to the other between archival footage. John Akomfar always loves using and researching archival footage, specifically from public archives, and it then sort of moves to new images or to the images that he has actually recorded on various sites throughout the planet. And so this Purple is specifically looking at the destruction of marine habitats, whereas other works sometimes have different organizations. So it's the marine habitat, it's the estuaries, it's the swamps, it's extreme weather phenomena and conditions that sort of change the way we inhabit the planet, and the climatic conditions that create extreme weather, extreme occurrences of so-called natural events of unprecedented magnitude. And that extremity, this idea of the extreme being the new normal, is of course something that we start to sort of see trickling through a lot of this work. The extreme is no longer something that only happens occasionally. The extreme is that with which we are faced to live with. And through extreme climatic conditions, obviously we have something which we also need to get accustomed more and more to, and that is the question of loss. And that comes through a lot of these works as well. So we're losing through extreme weather condition. We're losing certain ecosystems. We're losing certain ways of living together through weather situation, but also through pollution, through destruction of habitat. And so what do we lose? We lose everything. We lose reefs, we lose marine plants, fish and birds. We lose an aquatic life that is so intricate in its making. It's sort of conditions of coexistence. And I have little time to go in depth about it, but basically, let's see, here's a few other ones. So, yes, here's the expedition that John was on the boat. These are the Marquesas Islands. This is another view of the installation. So sometimes the screens work together, and sometimes all of the images sort of have different, all of the screens have different images. Yeah, so loss, as I said, the meaning of loss, what does it mean when we start losing the elements of our environments, of our life forms, which is really very much one of the main questions of this other work by Amar Kanwar, The Sovereign Forest, again a commission by TBA 21, a work we have really accompanied for many years. In general, have worked with Amar for almost a full decade. So the Sovereign Forest is really looks at this particular place, which is Kalinganagar in Orissa, in Odisha, in India, which used to be an ancient Indian kingdom, is still one of the places in India with the highest density of indigenous populations. As you can see, it is being turned into an aluminium extraction factory. It's a site of, again, utter destruction. As often, Amar doesn't really describe the political conditions as such. So although he comes from a filmic practice, both Amar and John, basically the way they describe transformation and loss, as I was saying, is not through documenting the sites of destruction and loss, but through an emotional heightened awareness that appears through the images, or in Amar's case, between the images. So he says, not what we see matters, but what we don't see. The loss is the point between, or the depth between sort of the images, that what we cannot comprehend. Non-comprehension, not comprehending, is sort of the utter expression of loss. And so what do we lose? We lose diversity, biodiversity. So the shrine of the rice that you see here in the middle of the space is a collection of 274 indigenous forms of seeds that he's collected together with a retired school teacher in Orissa, in the place where the crime is happening, displayed in this manner in the exhibition. Kalinganagar, as I said, is the scene of crime. That's the place where it's happening. It's not specified. It's called the scene of crime. And basically, the sovereign forest is the forest that celebrates, right, the constitution of otherness. And the constitution of otherness is both a film narrated, through these kinds of images, but also, no, the book is not here, doesn't matter. So it's part of a filmic work, but also part of a real constitution that Amar Kanwar has tried to bring in a book, in a printed form, into the exhibition, but it is a constitution without words. So basically, as the scene of the crime, as we start losing diversity, as we start losing lives, as one of the protagonists who doesn't have a name in the film, loses her husband, loses her house, loses her entity, as all of this is happening, the only place that remembers is the natural landscape, and is the forest, and the forest sort of sovereignty. And for that forest to be coexisting and sort of nurturing human lives and animal lives and post-human lives beyond our current future, for that we need a different constitution. That constitution, recall Bruno Latour, that constitution is one which gives equal rights to sort of all entities of the planet. And it cannot be a constitution that speaks in categories, as the constitutions we have known through sort of democratic principles. It is a constitution of the imaginary. Lighting Testimony, again, a film we were involved with. I will not so much speak about it, but it is one that looks at the violence against women, abduction in the Indian subcontinent, really from the partition to today, in the various sites of abduction. So it travels the whole continent, it looks at different temporalities, it connects different moments of injustice in trying to sort of, both represent and find life forms, find sort of life stories, and again, ask the question, where are these stories stored? So how can we tell? That's a really important question. How can we tell loss? What does it mean to carry over the trauma? How can we actually find ways to express everything that we are being divested of? And in this particular case, as you know, I mean, I wasn't going to talk, but mainly with rape and abduction, a huge problem is, but not only for rape, but a huge problem is how to actually speak of the violence against your body. Yeah? And we know, and especially in Indian context, many, many women, don't want to speak up. So where Amar actually finds the stories of rape, violence, and abduction is in the crafts, in the material production, and as I said before, in the sites of nature. So specifically here, there's always, the weaving, the textiles. The weavings are sort of forms of memorializing. Yeah? So memorialization in sites of nature, memorialization in crafts. Crafts, again, not just as an act of manual labor, but craft is an act of imagination. Craft is there where theory and hands meet. And it's a potential to tell a story, but it's also potential to sort of memorialize what is happening to a village, to a family, to to any kind of larger entity. And with that practice, Amar Kanva asked the question, so how can we make sure that poetics, the crafts of imagination, the poetics, the repopulation of the imaginary I was talking about, how can we make sure that these forms of evidencing actually are valued in our world? How can we make sure that maybe in future human rights, law cases, poetics actually can be used as a form of evidencing, even in a trial of justice. And that's a theoretical question, but one that, as I argued before, gives this incredible meaning again to the forms of the poetics, to the form of the imaginary, which I do believe, and I've urged us to believe today, we need in institutions of care. Armin Linke, how are we doing time-wise? She was supposed to wave. She's never waving. Okay. Prospecting ocean comes the closest to inhabitants, which I want to show a little bit. So prospecting is the act of discovering resources, on land or in the ocean. So prospecting ocean is actually a long-term research by German-Italian artist Armin Linke, trying to describe the next wave of exploitation in the oceans. And actually that, let's say, wave of exploitation is happening twofold in this particular analysis. One is through deep sea mining, and that is where we're connecting to the inhabitants. And the secondly is the exploitation and the patenting of the ocean's biota. And deep sea mining, I don't know if you've heard about it. Anyone knows about deep sea mining, more or less? Yes. Deep sea mining is a technology that was developed in the 1970s at the moment where it seemed that the mineral resources on our sort of the available mineral resources on terrestrial lands were coming to an end. Of course, the 70s, 80s were very much concerned with that, and therefore it was suggested that the endless resources of the ocean floor, would be sort of the next El Dorado, which is theoretically true. as we know, and for obvious reasons, the resource, the richness of resources on the seafloor is potentially incredible, but the thing we don't know is how sort of the ocean floor, or we do know a little bit, how the ocean floor, which has formed over millions and millions of years, once it is removed, you know, once it is extracted, most brutally, how it will influence sort of life in the ocean in the future, and in what ways regeneration is possible. We have to know that in the deep ocean, regeneration and all life processes are slowed down by the millions, right? So they say that for a nodule, for a polymetallic nodule to grow by 1 millimeter, it takes about 1 million years. Yeah? It is a very, 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 very slow process because, you know, the chemical processes are slowed down as deeper as you go. Yeah. So dredging the ocean floor, and what they really do is they send down these huge, huge machines, yeah, fully automated to 3,000 to 4,000 meters, and they just kind of excavate the ocean floor, because these polymetallic nodules they're looking at, they're just literally sort of sitting on the ocean floor. And so all of that is being assembled, you know, brought into sort of a machine that sort of cuts it down, you know, sends it up through long tubes to the surface, into sort of boats and vessels, and there it is processed and actually then dumped back into the ocean. So all of that, these processes of prospecting and excavation are so heavy industrial and so brutal, as you can imagine. So that is what is currently happening, or it's currently proposed. The prospecting, so I was in the 80s, 70s and 80s, technology was developed. It was really, really expensive at the time, postponed because, you know, new terrestrial forms of resources were found at the time. So prospecting was delayed. But obviously today, for many, many reasons, geopolitical interests, China, India coming into the world markets, we kind of know the sets of reasons. It has become, again, a huge priority. There's a lot of money spent. Plus, we have the technology from the large oil rigs. Yeah? All these oil rigs that have been actually placed. There's 1,500 oil rigs today sort of extracting oil and natural gas in the oceans. So with that technology and the same companies that are invested in oil and natural gas extraction, they are now moving into the deep. And where is it happening? It's happening exactly on the colonial frontier. So this is again Papua New Guinea, as you remember, our siphonophores. So Papua is actually the first country where a company called Nautilus has acquired the rights for offshore mining. They have made agreements with the government. The machines are there. Everything is sort of ready to go into action. They've been postponing the process. They've been postponing it for a number of reasons. They seem to have now great financial troubles, so we're hopeful that possibly the mining will not start as of yet. But, you know, whether it is in Papua or someone else, we know that this sort of great technology, I mean great in the sense of huge, enormous, mega technological frontier of the deep sea is going to be advancing very, very soon in one way or the other. So prospecting, Armin looks specifically at the situation in Papua New Guinea, and of course here we see activist protest against Nautilus's first attempt. Here again, Armin Linke, very often the way he works is he on one hand sort of looks at the sites where certain kind of let's say, injustices are happening. But more importantly, he looks at the institutions where decisions are made, where policies are implemented, where scientists are working, where lawmakers are making law. So he's interested at sort of the institutional organization of the Anthropocene, if you want. And so most of the photographs you see here are actually photographs of these institutional settings. Yeah? So this is obviously a situation at the Marum University, where a scientist is looking at a ROV that takes underwater images, and she, as we assume, looks at her screen and is interpreting sort of the images that come from 4,000 to 5,000 meters from the deep. Yeah? I think this is ESA, which is the International Seabed Authority, which is an entity of the United Nations. That's what I think it is. I'm not sure. These are the core samples. Sorry. These are core samples. So these are the samples that are taken from the ice cores and stored as kind of the libraries of the Earth. I'm not sure what this one is, I have to say, but some microbiological sample. Again, explanations about different zones, where you can see different minerals in the front, and how the scientist is actually explaining where these zones are located and where sort of extraction possibilities are planned, and fields of extraction allocated to either companies or public and private partnerships. Again, that's the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone, which is really, watch this one. This is really sort of the biggest underwater mine that we are going to see very soon in action. So all these zones, here you can see sort of the fragmented little zones where extraction rights have been allocated. This is, as I was saying before, in the high seas. Yeah? So here we are in the common heritage of humanity and mankind. So this is our inheritance. We have a say about this. It doesn't need to be going down this way, but since most of these processes are happening pretty much behind closed doors, there is very little knowledge about it. So the extraction of the Clarion Clipperton zone, fracture zone, would be, is my belief, and I don't speak as a geologist, would be a real disaster. So hopefully, we will all think about ways how to make it stop. Anyway, this is part of this work, to really pay attention to what is, or raise attention to what is happening, and to sort of differentiate between the scientific language, institutional language, the activist language, and sort of inform the public of the possibilities. So Suzanne Winterling, and I'm I'm sorry, I'm trying to push you through so much content here. Are we good? We're not good. Yes, then okay, I'll maybe just show you a couple of more works without explaining to it, because I think with Armin we can really move into inhabitants. Suzanne Winterling is a German artist who did this fantastic work on dinoflagellates, and now we're really moving into the ocean, and let's say the ocean, the sort of microscopic or submicroscopic and nanoscopic sort of inhabitants of the ocean, and how they are, these dinoflagellates, they have these blooms, these red blooms, such as the algae. And in their blooming, they're asphyxiating the ocean. So through the flagellates, the dinos, and through the algae, we see now recently these so-called dead zones in the oceans. They can be kilometers and kilometers. And dead zones are zones of, where actually the ocean will very likely never recover, maybe not never as in never, but not recover, because you have a dead zone, simply. And so she's sort of looking at these dinoflagellates, but she's looking at them, as I said earlier, from a position of intimacy, of engagement, not one of sort of describing it as the scientific alien, but one of saying, well, this is a life organism that has such a wonderful constitution. So what they do and how they do what they do is really, really beautiful and amazing. But to sort of see it also from a post-humanist entanglement position. So here are these dinos. And then Daniela Winterling, a sound artist who actually has spent the last 10 years recording the sounds of the oceans and making wonderful sound work out of it. So this would be the end of the things that I had prepared. And now we wanted to maybe just show a clip by the inhabitants. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. So it's again it's a series of work commissioned by TB 21 Academy. So far 3 works have been produced, episode 1 to 3. All 3 are on the Loop website. 2 more are in production.
Of the seabed from the 19th century were drawn from a collection of points obtained by dropping a weighted instrument from a ship.
The deep sea.
Before modern oceanography, in the West, the seabed was believed to be flat and lifeless. Sonar technology perfected during the Second World War expanded our understanding of the seabed. Sonar helped render an image of the deep sea in 3 dimensions. The first maps of the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean's rifts, ridges, and plateaus helped validate the theory of plate tectonics and continental drift, barely a decade before humankind set foot on the moon.
The deep sea. We still know less about the ocean floor than we know about the moon or Mars. Around 500 people have gone to space, while only 3 have reached the ocean's deepest point.
Today, the mapping of the seas is done from a vertical axis that combines geostationary satellites and submersibles.
The deep sea is a new frontier. It is only recently that we have begun to contact its inhabitants, forms of life utterly alien to us at the surface.
The technology that assists us in this process has extended vertically, both into the atmosphere and into the bottom of the ocean.
This is
I mean, you can maybe let it run just as images, no? Without that. I think you got the idea, basically. It's really very powerful work. It is organized around the idea of a newsroom. It has sort of the classical qualities of an info film, but of course uses very artistic and very beautiful and advanced technologies of visualization. Each episode has a different modality, a different also tone. They're all, let's say, newsy clips. They all have that sort of information quality, but both the way that images are organized, but also sort of the content is organized in different ways. Please do watch it. I think it's really, really powerful work. Share it. It is meant to live online. So the whole series of works that inhabitants are doing are meant for broadcasting on their own online service, but also shared and distributed, because mainly it is about sharing the knowledge and sort of creating different understanding and awareness. This is about the deep sea. There's other issues about the Anthropocene that are equally powerful. So I think that's really it. I mean, I ran through a lot of topics. Maybe just to, yeah, I'll take a few questions, but maybe just to sort of finalize the point. Yeah, institutions of care, institutions where we can create communities of caring for each other, caring about the way we engage with the topics that are incredibly important, using different tools of doing so, encouraging also our public to, engage with us in different manners. That was probably a little bit what I was hinting at, and hopefully we can have a discussion about. Thank you.
Tell us more about this community. How engaged are they, and how the artists approach to these communities? How is once they are there? How do you attract them or get in touch with them?
I would say it's I mean, it's a very good question. I would say that every every site, every locale has a little bit different ways of approaching it. Mostly, I mean, the ones I've shown at the very end, with Armin Linke in Papua New Guinea, when you look at the Pacific, normally there's a few things to keep in mind. The Pacific would, or what researchers of the Pacific would tell you is the Pacific is the most researched territory on this planet. Yeah? So they're really, really very wary of researchers, expeditions, and people that try to sort of classify who they are and what they are. The way the Pacific is organized in general is very much about permissions and trespassing. Having the permission to enter, why you enter, where do you enter, what do you bring with you, how do you share what you bring, how do you extract what you bring from the place. So there is a lot of thinking and very ingrained Pacific thinking about all of these questions of exchange and interaction. So case by case, it depends what exactly is the community you want to enter, and how do you find the best way to do so. It's a really tricky one, and it's definitely not one which opens up easily. A lot of organizations, specifically in Papua, have worked with churches. We have never done so, obviously, because the church is very strong in Papua, extremely strong, has a very strong network, and is internationally connected. Of course, as arts organizations, I would say arts, policy making, universities, these would sort of be activists. These would be sort of the first entry points we would look at. Certainly the concerns for the oceans, that are currently being manifested and fought for in the Pacific is a sort of new form of alliance which spans across the Pacific, but also connects to Europe and connects sort of worldwide. And the Pacific is very much at the forefront because of climate catastrophic sea level rises, where a lot of Pacific countries are very detrimentally affected by it. So the next decade is the decade of the oceans. The UN declared sort of research, and the Pacific is highly, highly motivated to have a voice in these policy processes. So that is a very good entry point through which actually to start spin relationships, to start engage with. But it's a very long time process. We've been now working in the Pacific for about 7 years. So, and we're still not there.
The artist already working in that matter, or or you ask them to get into the issue?
We are trying to sort of develop certain themes of research for about 3 to 4 years, together with curators or artist curators who we invite to do so. So it's an intersection between people invited, to sort of have a long-term research around the oceans with a certain set of questions and entry points. And in that intersection, things start happening. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting. Documentary and contemporary art.
Yeah.
Is there a border between the two of them? Should there be a border between the two of them? What you're showing me is very informative, yet it is also artistic. I was just curious to know what your views are on that subject.
Ooh, that's a very long, it's a very, very long discussion. I would say that obviously there's sort of not one answer, no? There's many, many answers. Artistic practice has learned tremendously from documentary practice and vice versa, and we are sure. And documentary is not documentary, no? Obviously, I would say that where I trust artists better, and take me off of the evidencing machines, because I'll be tortured for saying that. But where I trust artists better is in this relationship building that we were talking about before, which is, what does it mean to extract an image? What does it mean to enter into relationship? What is it actually? How we can collaboratively form a type of knowledge about a place, rather than, stringing a line of essayistic arguments through which, even if it is talking about the biggest forms of injustice, as I was saying before, but what very often documentary films do is they have a narrative, and things have to really fit into the narrative for obviously reasons. Most of the artistic time-based art that we know and see can live with contradiction, and can live beautifully with contradiction, and is sort of a layered narrative where things don't have to linearly be strung together, but can actually chaotically coexist. And that's why I believe that somehow artists are a bit kinder, let's say, to the subjects and the matter they engage with. And specifically now, as I was sort of saying also about Loop, I see a different engagement with matter and material around it. I think that a lot of artists are becoming very aware that matter is not just material. Matter has an intelligence and has an agency. And the way to represent the oceans or landscapes is not just sort of an object-subject relationship and nature-culture one, but it's one where, we actually have to, or I sense that artists do, feel a different kind of agential relationship.
We should wrap it up because there's the press conference of the fair that's taking place here. But Daniela will be with us, and actually she's in the jury of the fair, so she has a lot of work to do. Well, thank you so much for this inspiring presentation. I think that we should all think about what building up institution of cares mean. Collectively, in our personal relationship, in our working relationship, and I'm thinking about, the working environment in the cultural sector, in the art sector, because sometimes we preach, but we don't apply what you were saying. So I think, it's beautiful to leave it on that note. Let's all think about how it can be built up institution of care. Thank you so much again. And after the press conference at 12, there's a fair professional preview. So I invite you all to go up and see the videos. Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much.